Hello, welcome to Chapter 11, Cotton Slavery in the Old South. Okay, here's the highlights. The reason why we flip this around is Chapter 11 actually goes with Chapter 13 in terms of building up towards the Civil War. And just the way to think about Chapter 11 here, we're going to talk about economic changes here in the South, but then how those economic changes will lead to social changes for both blacks and whites. And that's kind of your conceptual framework for the unit. Okay, so what you have in the South is the rise of King Cotton. If you remember, during the colonial days, the South was known for its growing of tobacco. That's what really saved them. Um, and tobacco, just a little bit of a refresher. Tobacco was easily cultivated. You just need to, partially clear the land. Just labor intensive, and that's they started first with indentured servants, and then when that pool dried up, they turned to slavery. Um, but the other thing about tobacco, it tended to exhaust the land. It took 9 months to grow, so it was quite a long time. Um, what happens is they turned to short staple cotton, and so short staple cotton was easier to grow, but it's had seeds in it, so you had to pluck the seeds out, which made it not very practical. But what happens is, if you remember, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin in an attempt to try to get rid of slavery, actually makes slavery more profitable. So Eli Whitney, with his cotton gin and the importation of slaves being banned in 1808, that makes the price of slaves and the profitability of slavery and cotton expand. Okay, and so there's an expansion of slavery into the Southwest. There we'll move into the Black Belt, Mississippi, Alabama, into Texas, and that's where we get the growth of King Cotton. Okay, that's an example of the cotton gin being used. In terms of Southern trade and industry, it was essentially non-existent. Okay, so manufacturing, I think, was 2% of the Southern economy. Um, the transportation sector was poor compared to the North. And essentially what happens in DuBois reviews, they point out the fact that the South is subservient to the North. Okay, they are totally dependent on the North for manufactured goods, for their food, for everything. And so if the South wants independence, it's going to have to learn how to make things and grow other things by itself. Okay, show you the areas of cotton production in 1820. Then by 1860, you can see how it has, one, expanded, but two, really moved to the southwest area. Okay, plantations, 1858. That's what a plantation would look like, again, based off the river. Um, so the reason that took place, and the reason why there's no manufacturing, or far less manufacturing in the South, one, it's humid, very hot in the summers, so difficult to work in factories there. Second reason is that there's not very much capital. So capital, the money that you would need to start a factory, the capital in the South is tied up in the land and in the slaves. And so it's not very easy to get out. You would have to either sell all your slaves or sell your land, but then you'd have no place to build your factories. And third reason, maybe the most important reason, it's profitable. So grown cotton is so profitable that there really is no need to turn to manufacturing. And what this gives rise to, and so this is some of the social aspects of it, gives rise to this cavalier image. Okay, so the cavalier image is that Southerners, even though it's not entirely true, but that Southerners live a life of chivalry, of leisure, of elegance, that they don't have to work very hard, and that in fact working in a factory would be kind of demeaning. Okay, so the social structures in the South, you have the planter class. At the top, you have the planter class, okay, and the planter aristocracy. Um, Even though about 25% of the society actually own slaves, and far fewer of those own multiple slaves. Okay, so the aristocracy dominates the political, economic, and social life of the region. And it's not the old world version of aristocracy. Um, and it's mostly a myth. Okay, so that they didn't just sit around living that cavalier life. They had to constantly search for land and profits, and buy and sell their goods, their cotton. So they had this aristoc they had this view of aristocracy. Sorry about that, but it was to some degree a myth. But the aristocracy class did dominate. Okay, picture the plantation. You can take a look at where they're growing things. So they did grow some food: rice, corn, cane, potatoes, peas. Okay, so when it comes to honor, this cult of honor, and so the what comes along with this lifestyle is that they had to defend women, they had to defend the institution of slavery, and kind of how you do that is you dueled, okay, with because dueling signified dignity and authority. Of course, with that cult of honor, that puts the Southern lady in an insubordinate status, okay, or not insubordinate, subordinate status. I'm sorry. Um, Not quite the separate spheres of women of the North, but they did have defined gender roles, okay. And what that meant for women, that they tend to have less education, tend to have more children, and the Southern plantation mixed children, children of mixed race on the plantation, of course, which is a constant reminder to the women of what's going on. Although she's really not in a position to complain, but the presence of those children certainly was a reminder to the lady of the plantation. And so for women on the plantation, they were cut off from the rest of the world. Okay, they were supposed to fill in for the husband in terms of managing the plantation when he wasn't there, but at the same time she was supposed to be a lady. And because the plantations were isolated, there really was no room or no outlet for their own interests. Okay, so with the social structure here in the South, again, the aristocracy is at the top. Underneath the aristocracy, you have the plain folk, and the plain folk are just the yeoman farmers. Um, Many of them did not own a slave, or if they did own a slave, they actually worked next to the slave, and they really did not ever produce enough to move up. Um, they the limited educational opportunity in the South. So even though there are some schools, there are often fewer of them in the South and of poorer quality. So if you were of the aristocracy, you could afford a better education for your children, but for the plain folk, that wasn't really possible. Um, and so another group that was kind of well, it was apart from them was the hill people. And so the hill people, it's like what it sounds. They lived on the hills. They really did not participate in the institution of slavery. So they grew their own food, subsistence farming. Um, they lived apart from the system. They weren't really dependent on the plantation, and they actually resented slavery. Okay, they did not support like the Civil War when that came around. And so, part of the question with all of society, if there was such a hierarchical society, why did people support that? Okay, and part of the answer to that is the close relations they had with the plantation aristocracy. A lot of times there would be a kin network, and so there'd be some relationships there. But also they depended on the plantation for many things, like the extension of credit. They needed their mills there for grinding some of their crops. Needed them for blacksmith servicing, for shipping goods in and out. And so there's this really intertwinement of the economy between, from the plantation owners on down to like the plain folk. And what united all of them was this idea of white superiority. Okay, and so you have the aristocracy and then the plain people, the plain folks, and that they were all above slavery. Okay, so better to be poor than to be a slave. But however, underneath that group, there was actually the poor white trash, or the clay eaters, and they were desperately poor. And so they're referred to as clay eaters because sometimes they would eat clay. And they might even be under. Well, they said Brinkley says the slaves even looked down on those people. Okay, so the legal basis for slavery really rested in the slave codes, and so the slave codes restricted the rights and opportunities of slaves. And if you remember, even going back to the colonial days, it even defined the idea of like who was black and then who could be enslaved. And so they still held on to the one drop rule, that if you had one drop of quote unquote black blood, you were black, which of course meant that all the offspring of the children, or the offspring that were produced when slave masters raped the slave women, would be slaves. The reality of slavery, though, is again that very few Southerners actually owned multiple slaves, and that for on the smaller farms uh, there was a sense of intimacy on the smaller farms because you're working alongside your slave. On the larger farms, though, there's the task and gang systems, and so for the different tasks, you could be assigned to the house where you would be responsible for the cooking and cleaning and taking care of the children, or the be assigned to the field where you would work out in the farms. Okay, in the gang system, you'd be hired out to do specific projects. Okay, so life under slavery, switching now away from white society now onto the slave society. Um, Women have a special position. So women, not only do they have to work, but they are still responsible for the cooking, cleaning, and taking care of kids. And sometimes as single parents. Okay. Um, Despite the Southern claims that they care for their slaves like family, there's a high slave mortality rate. Often they had just enough food to eat, and were taken care of just enough to so that they lived. They certainly weren't prospering, obviously, under slavery. And again, you have some house slaves, and so the house slaves in particular were subject to sexual abuse. Okay, that working in such close confines that it often led to rape of the slave women. Okay, slavery in the cities. There's very few slaves in the cities. One in part because uh, it's just too easy to run away in the cities, too easy to kind of disappear. So that was actually a rarity. In terms of free African Americans, there's about 250,000 of them, but it was harder to free, and Southerners were generally against freeing slaves because what what it might do is inspire other slaves to want their own freedom, and then there's ongoing fear of revolt. Okay, again, the successful revolution in Haiti was never too far off from the minds of many Southerners. Okay, so in terms of the slave trade and the slave markets, if you remember, the international slave trade had been banned, so there's no importing of new slaves, although there was smuggling since 1808. And so what happens is the interstate slave trade becomes profitable. Okay, and it's inhumane. The children are separated from their parents, um, and the whole slave market ideal runs counter to kind of this idea of chivalry. The planters actually look down on the slave traders. Okay, it's necessary, but certainly not a not an esteemed profession. Okay, switching back, the slave resistance, and so what you have is you do have slave rebellions. Okay, and so I think there's this myth that the South back then, maybe today, propagates is this idea that slaves were happy, that they liked the institution of slavery. And I think you only need to look at the number of rebellions that took place to understand that that's not the case. So Gabriel Prosser was one. It was planned, never pulled off. Nat Turner, Prosser was 1800. Turner was in 1831. Led a rebellion that was successful temporarily, but eventually the militia was called out and the slave rebellion was put down, and Turner was executed. But there's other ways that slaves resisted. Um, Little acts of rebellion, so you can break your equipment, you can slow down, you can run away, and so they're certainly not as helpless as some people like to think of them, and certainly not happy. And that's the big lie in terms of again of slaves being happy in their position. And some of this resistance, let me bring this up here, it gives rise to the stereotypes. And so what in Southerners' minds justified the existence of slavery was that for the stereotypes of men, they were dangerous. Okay, so the dangerous male was called referred to as the buck. Okay, that he had to be controlled. And there's always this threat of violence. But then also they had a contrary stereotype. The lazy male was the Sambo, and the Sambo is the lazy male that wouldn't do anything unless you pushed him, and that's why we needed slavery. where those really could be just the acts of resistance by those slaves. Same thing for the female. So the female stereotype, the one that would take care of your children and was a good homemaker, um, was the mammy stereotype. Sorry, I forgot it for a sec. So the mammy stereotype. But then, contrary to that, was the female slave seductress that would tempt the males into sex, and that's what accounted for their sexual, um, the sexual relations. There was the Jezebel. And so again, that the slave stereotypes help justify a lot of I think their treatment of slaves, when really in some cases it was acts of resistance, and in other cases for the females it rationalized, I think, in the slave owner's mind. Okay, so the culture of slavery that develops, they create their own form of pidgin English. It's a mix of African dialects and English. Um, there's slave spirituals that help them pass the time, um, share political views, share music. In terms of African American religion or slave religion, there's no churches, although some of their owners try to convert them to Christianity. It's loud, expressive, it's inspirational. And their religion tended to blend some African rituals into Christianity. Okay, and there's, I think you see this in with well, immigrants, although slaves aren't immigrants, but it's phenomenon that you tend to see when you get cultures mixing. In terms of the slave family, the marriages are informal, so they're not legal, but they're culturally binding. Um, because parents would be separated, was really dependent on the kinship networks to help take care of the children. Um, when the families were broken up, other folks would help watch and care for them. And I think something that you still see in the African American community today. Paternalistic nature of slavery, that you had to be dependent. Slaves were dependent on everything, right? So they weren't given the freedom really to provide for themselves, and so they create this dependency nature on the slave owners.